Empty Plane by Brendan Bozeman. You have to realize that statistically, most restructuring doesn't work, Garth said. Dan said, "You've told me before." As far as structure itself, there really isn't any more to do. We can clean up debt, we can streamline offices, we can consolidate and centralize jobs, we can even expand into some related merchandise. But none of this is going to change anything until we face the real issue. Garth was using we, so it would sound like a group effort. It softened the blow, even though they both knew he was going to move on from this project, one way or another. Dan Simmons, the CEO of Franklin Hardware Stores, sat silent. Garth had seen his type before, and he had made some predictable mistakes. Mistake number 1. He was a youngish man taking over a regional chain of hardware stores. Those were dinosaurs after Home Depot and Lowe's came onto the scene. This can be solved with a realistic attitude. That is, the knowledge that you are on a sinking ship, but their fate is unavoidable. Mistake number 2. He was too invested emotionally. Dan Simmons was from the area, and he wanted to revitalize the chain and set himself up with a good profit for himself. He had memories of coming to the store with his dad and had no desire to expand or contract. Just keep the ball rolling. That sounds nice, but loving trains doesn't bring back Amtrak, and it leaves you with some big boy choo-choos that hopefully Daddy can afford. Mistake number 3. He wanted to be the town hero. He knew the former owner and a lot of the employees, and they were all afraid of losing their jobs or having to work for Home Depot, and everyone in town wanted to support local business. What Dan didn't realize is that the gratitude for George Bailey probably didn't last too much longer than the party. In the long run, loyalty goes to 15% lower prices at Home Depot, and Zuzu will have to find some new pedals. Dan recognized all these factors, didn't deny them, and was willing to change. Things didn't have to be exactly like the old days. He'd probably not be as profitable as he thought, and he would likely be just another local businessman. He also knew what Garth meant by the real issue. The only problem was that he kept avoiding that last point. He would keep bringing the topic back to restructuring, and the conversation would go in a big circle. Dan, you know what I'm about to say. All these steps only work with a smaller workforce. And if we present ourselves to the banks with the present structure, sure, we can make something work, but you won't be able to slim down and get the deal you really need. You can't reallocate without converting some of this to capital. And that means offering up a viable plan. Otherwise, you're just bailing out the Titanic. God, not another metaphor, said Dan, turning his face to the window. Yeah, I'm a broken record. Dan gave a light laugh through his nose, just a little puff of air. Dan, I'll do the firing. I'm used to it. And delivering the bad news is better done by a third party. It doesn't mean you're running away. Trust me, your employees won't want to face you either, even if they say they do. They see it coming too, and they don't want to end on a sour note with you. You can always talk to them later or send them a note. Garth stated this advice like a general principle, but it was really a tactic. He was matching Dan's capabilities with the role he could handle. If Dan did the firing, he'd probably come back with a stack of new contracts and all the same employees as before, with the addition of a cousin or a brother or two. If Garth were talking with someone a little more battle-hardened, he would say the best thing to do would be to talk to them himself. He'd say they'd both feel better about it. Then he'd coach them a little, tell them about someone like Jack Welch. When Jack Welch fired someone, they would leave the room feeling like they had gotten a promotion. But Dan was Dan. If he were Jack Welch, Garth wouldn't be there. Dan was still staring out the window. There are only so many spaces on this lifeboat. A smaller company will survive 15 or 20 years, and then you can reassess and find another new way forward. That's the way business works. If this stays a big company, it will survive 5 years and go under. Dan leaned far back in his swivel chair and worked both hands into his pockets. In his day, Joe Franklin was the jerk who drove everybody else out of business. 50 years ago, all you had around here was little hardware stores. Then he came along, put his heart and soul into the hardware stores, and took them over one by one. And a lot of people hated him for that. Garth was sitting forward, elbows on his knees, fingertips pressed together. And then everybody got attached to this company. Garth waited. All right, Garth, you win. I guess we can start Monday. Let them have one last weekend of peace. He pursed his lips in a frown and looked at Garth. Dan wasn't looking so good, so Garth decided not to stretch things out. There was no need to, anyway. The lists were already drawn up, and it was just a matter of implementation. He stood up and extended his hand. You're doing the right thing, he said. Quick change back to you rather than we. Garth took his hand without standing up and said, See you Monday. Garth still had plenty of time to catch his plane. He'd spent enough wasted evenings like that, with a long time to wait but not enough to do anything interesting. He thought Toledo was boring. There weren't any movies he wanted to see, and he didn't want to sit in the hotel room watching TV. So he gravitated to the hotel restaurant, where he ordered a coffee. He had nothing to do but think about nothing. That including having nothing to plan for when he got home. Charlotte wouldn't be there to greet him, not anymore. He used to look forward to telling her about the trip, and somehow she managed to be interested, or pretended to. He liked to call her Charlie, and with the way the modern world was going, he would have fun with people who didn't know him well by saying that he was going home to Charlie, that he loved Charlie, that he knew it from the first time he met. Then he would purposely get distracted so they wouldn't get him either to say him or her. Small pleasures. He wouldn't call his sons either. Both were married and raising kids across the country, i.e., not much time to talk to old Dad. He had one daughter, same situation, but she didn't like to talk to him much anymore anyway. He didn't know where that started, but she disagreed with his approach to child rearing, business, religion, politics, movies, food, cars, what French people were like, you name it, his whole approach to life. And nowadays he wasn't even interested in any of those topics, much less possessed of any strong opinions about them. He had gone back to work out of sheer boredom. He had never developed any hobbies or outside interests. Work was his only focus outside family, and now it was his only pastime. He barely even talked to old friends. Nowadays, frequent contact was a call every year or two. He wondered if Dan Simmons had profiled him, what his top 3 mistakes would be. Would they be as clear to Dan as Dan's were to him? You could see Dan looking at him 10 years ago, saying, Garth, the real issues are this, this, and this. Take care of those, and you've got 20 or 30 years before you get lonely. If you don't, 5 years, and you're a sinking ship. How right that would have been. The decks were getting lower and lower, and that cold, cold water was looking better all the time. Work at least took his mind off things. Once he was into a project, presto, 5 weeks would go by. He ought to be happy about that. He wasn't in pain, and he didn't have dementia. Not much in pain, anyway. It was just the downtimes that got him pondering things too much. This Friday and weekend seemed long. After a while, The waitress brought him a newspaper, which he accepted with thanks, and he ordered. He was not looking forward to the flight. He had developed a dread for flying in the past months, and it hovered ever closer like a shadow in his peripheral vision as any flight got nearer. Time seemed to change pace, faster and slower at the same time. He wasn't afraid of crashing, and he didn't feel claustrophobic or have any trouble getting on. His fear was that he wouldn't get off, and not because he would have a heart attack or something. He was afraid he would vanish. Over the last several months, there was always a passenger that didn't get off the flight. Usually, in a plane load of passengers, there would be at least one person who had funny glasses or walked with a limp, something that would catch his attention, and he would see the person getting off at the end as well. But he started to notice that one of those people would not be among the passengers lined up to get off. Garth flew business class, so he was always one of the first on the plane, and upon landing, he habitually stayed in his seat until he was the last person on the plane. It would be him and the flight attendants in that empty plane. He found that less stressful than jumping up and rushing to get out as fast as possible, and he was rarely under time pressure getting to a job, and certainly not going home. That gave him a chance to see everyone getting on and everyone getting off, and he was sure there was always someone missing. Naturally, he thought that was being silly. He just hadn't found them in the line, that's all. Or perhaps they were all the way in the back still, equally determined to be the last one off, or had gone to the bathroom. But the line moved slowly, and he had a chance to give everyone a good look. And sometimes he waited and waited until a flight attendant would politely insist that he leave. He tried to be realistic. He was probably just imagining things. Who's to say the person wasn't stuck in his memory from some other flight? He had been on so many, it didn't seem unreasonable that he could make a mix-up like that. Or perhaps the person had changed clothes. He knew people who did that, either to get ready for a meeting or to dress back down after one. It wasn't common, but it wasn't out of the question. He also wondered if perhaps dementia was sneaking up on him. But several weeks back, the problem was stuck right in his face, so it couldn't be ignored. A very overweight man with a Hawaiian shirt and big gold glasses had sat right next to him. Even in business class seats, his presence was impossible to ignore. He even had a distinct smell of cologne that Garth recognized. And he had talked to him for several minutes. His name was Walt. Garth had slept for a time on that flight, and when they landed and he was jostled awake, the man was gone. Since the business class cabin is fairly small, there was no way he could have left it. Thinking perhaps he had taken a first-class seat without the ticket, it's been done before, and had been exiled to the back while Garth was asleep, he waited until everyone was off, and he never reappeared. Garth even asked a flight attendant about him, and she said that there was no one else left on the flight. But you remember him. He was right here. Perhaps you can call your friend and ask where he is. I don't know him, not personally. I just know he was here, and the attendant was looking at him funny, so Garth scrambled for a lie. And I had a question for him. I'm afraid I can't help you. We've checked the plane, so he must be in the concourse. Garth dropped it. He looked like a confused old man, and he simply got his bag and left. He knew the man wouldn't be in the concourse, but he looked all around anyway as he walked through, and the man was nowhere. After that, he made sure to be the first one on each flight, waiting up at the kiosk before it was opened, and kept careful track of everyone going through. He even bought a little camera and tried to film the passengers as they got on and off, though that didn't work because it reeked of suspicious behavior. So he did something simpler and more reliable. He bought a tally counter. 1 click per passenger. 1 for each coming on, 1 for each getting off. And at the end of the flights, the counter always read 1. And he wasn't accidentally counting himself. He wasn't just a forgetful old man making up stories after all. He could remember the people who were missing. He would ask the flight attendants, "Did you know where that guy with the gold rings is? He must have deplaned, sir." The cause of this phenomenon kept him awake the night before flights and bothered him especially in the hours leading up to them. Who would be the next one to disappear? Would it be he? But while it caused him fear, it also created a kind of longing. He wasn't sure that he didn't want to be the next one. He was nearly at the airport, and he went to the VIP lounge. Another hour or so of nothing. He wished there was a double first-class ticket, like a Disney VIP tour. A ticket for a plane that just took off on time no matter what, no security. He guessed that would have to be a private jet, maybe in the next life. He dozed off at his chair and had a strange dream. No one was in the VIP lounge. He heard his name being called. He was late and had to hurry, so he hustled over to his gate. No one was there but one flight attendant checking people on. She took his ticket with a smile and motioned for him to board. There was another flight attendant there along with the pilots. She ushered him to his seat. He was the only one on the plane. The dream did not wake Garth up, but he remembered it as he walked to his gate. It didn't scare him. On the contrary, it somehow calmed him down. When he reached his seat, his hand went for the counter, but he put it down. He would read the paper, and he would make himself be interested in it. The next day, he went to the home office, even though there wasn't much to do. They were getting a couple of new clients started, and that mostly had to do with briefing consultants, which he didn't do anymore. He made a few phone calls, and he kept an eye out for a call from Dan, hoping there wouldn't be one. That would only mean he was getting cold feet. He also had 2 interviews. He had personally requested doing interviews, and his old protege David, who was now CEO, thought it was a great idea to have the founder of Bolding Consultants test out the new blood. What Garth really wanted was the conversation. Like most interviewers, he made his decision in the first 30 seconds, and after that, he was mostly passing the time. The extra conversation did provide more information if he was going to recommend a hire, though. First of all, he would find out if the person could make small talk with the client interesting. That was the skill one needed with a client like Dan, who needed time to adjust to unwelcome ideas. It was also needed for good client memories. What a consultant wanted most was a client who would pay happily and call you back, perhaps even recommend you to others. Whether the client actually implemented the recommendations didn't matter as much. Truthfully, most clients who needed consultants were in need because they couldn't make tough decisions or follow through on them. And after the consulting time was over, they usually regressed to the mean. It was the broad brushstrokes that took place while the consultants were there that gave their companies new life. And for a client to credit the consultant and not himself for a job well done meant getting him to like the consultant. Most people would prefer to forget the consultant was ever there. So getting to 10 or 20% of the credit was a big success in Garth's eyes. This candidate, Martin, had that ability. The way Garth knew was by pushing him off balance in the conversation. In this case, he pretended to have a wandering, conversation about Martin's past. He found some common experiences and made a few up, too, to get him to think he was just shooting the breeze. But he was looking for weaknesses. In Martin's case, it was sports. He was the bad player who never contributed to the team and only took part so he had something on his resume. What Martin did was cast that in a good light and allow for some self-deprecating humor. He conveyed that he may have hated it in a way, but he made the most of it. That was a plus in Garth's eyes. Martin would have to bring that feeling out in his clients. Then, they would feel good about an uncomfortable situation. Garth's report on Martin was simply a blank sheet of paper with a crudely drawn thumbs up. If David wanted to hear more, he could come and talk to him. That left him with the weekend, and he was hoping it would not just be watching TV. His sons would not be visiting anytime soon, so he called them, but they wouldn't stay on the phone more than 5 minutes. He got to talk to his grandchildren, but those conversations were short by necessity. Any longer than 3 minutes was Grandpa getting to be a burden. He didn't begrudge them that. That was just human nature. But that amounted to about 15 minutes of phone time for the weekend. His daughter was not to be raised. Saturday was spent doing a little yard work and forcing himself to read a book, but most of his time was spent watching the news. Sunday he went to church. He wasn't a churchgoer before retirement and went solely for the sake of having something to do. By Sunday afternoon, he was telling himself he would either have to cheer up or go insane. He forced himself out the door to go to a movie and a restaurant, but those things hardly shortened the day. He couldn't get to sleep for a long time, though he went down early. He was kind of hoping he would have that dream again. Monday, Garth did the dismissals in the break room, which was alternately used as a conference room. He knew what to expect and had no emotion about it. In the employees, there would be fear, sadness, outrage, helplessness, feigned defiance, insults, pleas, silence, threats, life stories, aspersions on other employees, and most of all, condemnations of Dan for not having the courage to do it himself. One by one, they came in and out. There were 2 promotions that he put in the mix, so that a little hope was preserved among the others. A true gallows march could result in an employee's suddenly disappearing, which complicates matters. He'd seen it himself. He was disdainful of none of them, though. He had seen the same reaction many times. He understood their pain, but he knew how to compartmentalize his own feelings. He'd learned from a doctor that the only way to give bad news is calmly and professionally. That done, he was ready to get started on the financials. This he did over the next week, meeting with banks and so forth. It wasn't much work, but it required being there, and there was little point in flying back and forth. The home office work he could do online or on the phone. Dan was looking better and better as the week went by. That was familiar to Garth. Once the deed is done, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. There's a plan. Dan went around to each of the fired employees to have a small private conversation with them, and as the days went by, he grew more professional with each one. Garth thought that was good. Dan would need that gravitas going forward. Thursday rolled around, and he said his goodbye and good luck to Dan with a firm handshake. He could go home that evening, but he decided to stay anyway. He was feeling old, and he'd be better off with a little more energy. The next morning, he put a suitcase out to be picked up and taken to the airport, and then went down for breakfast. He was in the airport lounge when he got a call from the hotel. "Did I forget to kiss you goodbye?" he said. We are happy to serve our customers as well as possible, and you are a special client. In this case, I'm afraid there's bad news. An employee found a collection of your belongings in a dumpster behind the hotel. We identified them as yours by your name on a few documents, but there were no valuables, and the suitcase was gone. To confirm, we think you had aluminum and a way silver suitcase, yes. We can reimburse you for the bag and offer a $1,000 compensation for the contents. Garth thought. Even with all the time in the world, that suddenly seemed like too much of a hassle. Look, don't worry about it, he said. I have my carry-on. I don't need the rest. Sir, we would like to make it right. That's fine. Yes, sir. I'm required to compensate you. If you'd like to refuse, please complete the form I'll send by email. Garth rolled his eyes. All right, send a new case and $1,000. That's fine. So you'd like me not to send the email? No, forget the email. Just whatever's fastest. Yes, sir. Garth hung up and turned off his ringer. The only mystery to him was why the thief had not just left with the suitcase. They must have found nothing good inside and then realized the bag itself was worth $800. An amateur either way. He played with his wedding ring, taking it off and on. He started to get a strange feeling in his head. Not quite a headache, but something like pressure building up. Was it stress? It felt like blood was rushing to his head, and a fine static sound took over his ears. Is it a stroke, he wondered? He stood up and went toward the gate. His balance was okay, and he was not walking funny. Then everything became silent, and he had a strange feeling of painlessness. That is, he could feel none of the little aches and pains that accompanied him everywhere he went. He could see other people walking around, but he couldn't hear their voices. They didn't seem real. And then everything started to look gray. At the gate, there was just one flight attendant. Her skin was gray, and it had cracks in it as though it could flake off in large pieces. She took his ticket and motioned him toward the boarding bridge. He could feel his steps as he walked, but not hear them. At the door to the plane, there was another flight attendant, also gray and cracked. But this time, flakes of skin were fluttering down as she said hello and nodded. The pilot was there too, and he looked the same. He gave Garth a deep, dark look. The attendant escorted him to his seat and helped him put his carry-on in the overhead bin. Thank you, he said, watching her skin flake. There were passengers in the rest of the seats when he got on. He was sure of that. He even recognized some of them. He recognized the guy in the Hawaiian shirt and the gold glasses. There were others he recognized from other flights, and they looked him in the eye. They smiled. But everyone else getting on was a regular person. He felt faint and sat down heavily and rubbed his eyes. When he opened them, the plane was empty. Only the flight attendant stood at the front of the plane. He waved at her, and she came over to him quickly. His chest felt heavy, and he leaned forward, shutting his eyes. He felt the attendant's hand on his shoulder, and he sat up again. The flight was full of people, and he could hear everything. Just relax, Mr. Boulding. We want you to have a pleasant trip. Today, you're a special customer. The pilot's voice came over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be skipping the safety lecture. We're leaving immediately. The plane backed out and rolled away without any stopping and starting, just a smooth ride to the runway. The engines roared, and in 2 minutes total, they were in the air. It was a smooth flight. Garth was painless and relaxed, and he reclined his seat and shut his eyes. The last thing he heard was the engines getting quieter and quieter.